June 4, 1943. The summer heat shimmers off the railroad tracks in Mejia, Texas, as a passenger train rolls to a stop with an almost ceremonial precision. The engine's whistle cuts through the humid air, and for a moment, everything is still. Then the doors open, and 1,850 men step onto American soil for the first time. They are veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, hardened soldiers who had pushed the British back to the gates of Alexandria, who had earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself. But today, they are prisoners of war, and what they are about to witness will shatter everything they believed about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. Among them stands Unteroffizier Vera Burkhardt, his Afrika Korps uniform still bearing the dust of Tunisia. In his hidden diary, his pencil trembles slightly as he writes words that would have earned him a death sentence from his own officers. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. Through the train window, he had just witnessed something that contradicted 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights blazed from every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window, an endless constellation of electricity stretching across the Texas plains at 10 o'clock at night. This moment marks the beginning of one of the most remarkable transformations in military history. Not a transformation of territory or political boundaries, but a transformation of minds. These soldiers, indoctrinated by one of history's most sophisticated propaganda machines, were about to confront a reality so overwhelming that it would systematically demolish everything they had been taught to believe about America, about democracy, and about their own nation's destiny. The story that unfolds from this moment is not just about prisoners of war. It's a story about the power of truth over propaganda, about industrial might as a weapon of conversion, and about how witnessing abundance could accomplish what no battlefield victory ever could. It's about how America won its most important victory, not through bombs or bullets, but through the simple, overwhelming evidence of what free people could achieve when they worked together. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary chapter of World War II history, take a moment to subscribe if you love these kinds of historical documentaries, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from around the world. The roots of this transformation stretch back to the scorching sands of North Africa, where the German Afrika Korps had written some of the most legendary chapters in military history. Under the command of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, these soldiers had achieved the impossible, turning what was meant to be a minor Italian support mission into a campaign that brought the Axis to the very threshold of the Suez Canal. The Afrika Korps represented the pinnacle of German military prowess, experienced, disciplined, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. But by May 1943, the mathematics of industrial warfare had caught up with German ambitions in Africa. The soldiers who would soon find themselves on trains to Texas had been part of one of the most catastrophic military defeats in German history. The collapse came swiftly and completely on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia, when General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered, along with approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers. The numbers varied as scattered units continued surrendering over several days, but the magnitude of the defeat was undeniable. Among the captured was Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross, First Class, veteran of the France campaign, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, would provide historians with the most detailed account of the psychological impact of American captivity on German soldiers. But Radke and his comrades could never have imagined that their journey from defeat to revelation was just beginning. The processing of these prisoners revealed the first glimpses of American organizational capacity that would eventually shatter Nazi preconceptions. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners daily with an efficiency that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved, even at the height of its power. Identity cards were photographed and filed with mechanical precision. Medical examinations were completed, inoculations administered. Geneva Convention rights explained in fluent German by American officers who had been trained specifically for this moment. This wasn't the chaotic collapse that Nazi propaganda had predicted would follow American military engagement. This was systematic, thorough, and overwhelmingly competent. But the first real shock came with something far more basic than organizational efficiency. It came with food. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, would later write to his mother, in the cage at Oran, "While we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration." This simple meal represented something far more profound than American generosity to prisoners. It was the first crack in the ideological foundation that had sustained German resistance. These soldiers had been told that America was a nation weakened by decadence, crippled by economic depression, barely capable of feeding its own people. Yet here they were, enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers just days earlier, being fed better than German troops in the field. The Liberty ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial capacity, though the prisoners had no way of knowing the full extent of what they represented. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in Richmond, California, in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser shipyards. This fact would have been dismissed as impossible propaganda if the Germans had known it. These vessels, produced at a rate of 3 per day at the peak of production, were returning from delivering supplies to the European theater. Rather than sail back empty, they carried human cargo, up to 30,000 prisoners of war per month by summer 1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing in July 1943 provided the second phase of what American intelligence officers would later term psychological demolition. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept detailed accounts that survived in letters to his family after repatriation. What he witnessed aboard ship challenged fundamental assumptions about American society and its capacity for war production. The ship's crew, he noted, disposed of more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. This wasn't casual observation. Zimmermann had been a supply sergeant and understood logistics intimately. The American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long, he wrote. They did this openly, without thought, not to mock us, but because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. The ships themselves became floating classrooms in American power. Prisoners discovered that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,710 Liberty ships that would be built during the war, each one requiring 250,000 parts assembled from components manufactured in 32 states. The engines, they learned from talkative American guards, were built in 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Steuben, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This technology, which we believed only we and perhaps the British possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war. But suspicion is different from certainty. And the prisoners aboard these Liberty ships were still processing information through the filter of Nazi ideology. They rationalized what they saw, explaining away evidence that contradicted their worldview. The real transformation would begin when they set foot on American soil and confronted an industrial reality so vast that rationalization became impossible. August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, the first site of America proper, shattered the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness, like glass meeting a hammer. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching for miles, its cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. In a single day, This one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. But statistics couldn't capture the psychological impact of witnessing this machinery of war production in full operation. Jeff Reiter, Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading from his position in the prisoner column. Each crane, he noted in his secret diary, lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the coal smoke that choked our industrial cities. This wasn't just superior technology. It was superior technology deployed on a scale that defied German comprehension. The prisoners were formed into columns for the march to waiting trains, but even this short journey became an education in American abundance. Along the route, they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them belonging to dockworkers. In Germany, private automobile ownership remained a privilege of the wealthy and the party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, remained a propaganda dream with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians. Here, ordinary laborers drove to work in their own cars, a casual display of prosperity that challenged fundamental Nazi assumptions about class, labor, and industrial organization. But nothing prepared them for the trains themselves. Not boxcars, not the 40 and 8 inches wagons that had carried German troops across Europe, but full passenger coaches. Pullman cars with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. Hauptmann Radke wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." The American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in their car. Air conditioning. In August, these German soldiers had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train. Yet here it was, standard equipment on what the Americans casually referred to as a regular passenger service. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat could have been. As the trains rolled through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and beyond, the prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that simply couldn't exist according to everything they had been told about their enemies. Every small town blazed with illumination. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro communities that in Germany would have been fortunate to have a single electric street lamp, displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940, even before the war. Rural electrification had reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had described as a decadent, collapsed America, electricity flowed like water. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, parking lots full, even at midnight. Oberg Fritter Mayer, whose father was a Nazi party bloc leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Every one had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we would see." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers performed in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems, every aspect of the operation demonstrated not just technological superiority, but the systematic application of that technology across the entire infrastructure of American society. More disturbing still was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties into bins without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished, a display of casual waste that spoke to abundance beyond German imagination. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Essen before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they stopped in used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered American industrial power in its full, overwhelming display. Through the windows, they watched endless factories, each one larger than anything most had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich required. Near Louisville, the train slowed as they passed the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the synthetic rubber process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, understood the implications immediately. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them just in this one location. They told us there were dozens more across the country, but perhaps the most devastating sight was yet to come." The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts, manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors spread across the continent. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hauptmann Werner Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion visible from the train. "We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat," he later wrote. "But I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible." The deeper the trains penetrated into America, the more complete became the destruction of Nazi mythology. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, while below them barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. The prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition in endless quantities without concern for loss. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration in Kansas City." The train stopped at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles. German prisoners who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, when lucky, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during their lunch break. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Jeff writer Paul Fisher. "No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread. The guard bought us hamburgers from a stand near the station, meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them without thinking, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not special. This was their normal food." The cumulative effect of these observations was producing what would later be documented as a systematic collapse of Nazi ideological conditioning. These weren't isolated incidents or propaganda displays staged for prisoner consumption. This was the casual abundance of an entire continental industrial civilization operating at peak capacity while simultaneously fighting wars on 3 continents. The scale was so vast, so comprehensive, that individual acts of denial or rationalization became impossible. The arrival at the camps themselves provided the next level of what American intelligence officers were quietly calling cognitive demolition. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians in pre-war Germany. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat, each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astounded the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberstars Dr. Friedrich Babor, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941, all standard provision for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Babor would later testify, this miracle drug that we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfa drugs, and the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. Part 1 of this extraordinary story has shown us how German prisoners first encountered American industrial might and began to question everything they had been told. But their transformation was just beginning. In Part 2, we'll explore how the simple act of feeding these prisoners would continue to demolish Nazi propaganda, and how German soldiers would witness agricultural and industrial production on a scale that would make their homeland's capabilities seem almost medieval by comparison. The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity, though the German prisoners could hardly have imagined they were being enrolled in a course that would fundamentally alter their understanding of industrial civilization. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for 5,000 men with an efficiency that exceeded anything they had witnessed in the Wehrmacht's most advanced field kitchens. The daily ration provided to enemy prisoners included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities that German civilians had unseen since 1939. But it wasn't just the abundance that shocked these men, it was the casual waste that accompanied it. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote with a mixture of amazement and anguish, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The American regulations require we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage." This systematic waste spoke to something far more profound than American generosity or inefficiency. It revealed a production capacity so vast that abundance could be planned into the system as a margin of error. In Germany, where every calorie had been calculated and rationed since the early days of the war, such casual discard of perfectly edible food represented a form of wealth that transcended their previous understanding of national resources. By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture and light industry had led to a decision that would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. Groups of prisoners began to be trucked daily to work sites throughout the American heartland, traveling through landscapes without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything: the endless fields of corn and wheat, the factories running 3 shifts, the shops full of goods, the parking lots full of cars, the houses with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire Bavarian village could have handled in a month using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody's special, Lang recorded in his diary. Not aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including the Negroes, ate lunch from boxers containing more food than German workers received in a week, and this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields, witnessing agricultural mechanization that challenged their fundamental assumptions about farming, labor, and productivity. A single combine harvester, they learned, could do the work of 100 men. The fields stretched to the horizon, each one larger than entire German counties, producing yields that would have been considered fantasy in the Reich. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 bushels on the best land. Jeff writer Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote with barely concealed amazement, "The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father had earned in his lifetime." When I mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better. But the most devastating revelations came to those prisoners who worked near or in American factories. While Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work, prisoners of war could work in industries that freed American workers for military production. This technicality allowed thousands of German soldiers to witness American industrial capacity firsthand, and what they saw systematically demolished every assumption about American economic weakness. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German food processing plants handled in a month. The facility operated with what the Germans initially assumed was a skeleton crew, mostly women and elderly men, as most young workers were in the military. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels through mechanization and efficiency that seemed almost magical to observers accustomed to German industrial methods. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented the experience with the precision of an engineer. Everything was automated. Electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee from a ceramic cup, as if managing industrial production was as casual as household work. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant gained glimpses of the automotive industry's conversion to war production that would haunt their understanding of German industrial capacity for the rest of their lives. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers, producing jeeps, aircraft, engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. "We could see the parking lots," wrote Obergefreiter Franz Kellner. "Thousands of cars belonging to workers. Workers. In Germany, even our officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory workers drove to work. The guard told us many workers owned 2 cars, one for work, one for family use. We thought he was mocking us, but we could see them with our own eyes. Row after row of automobiles that belonged to people who worked with their hands." By winter 1943, the cumulative impact of these observations was producing what American intelligence officers had begun to classify as ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The Special Projects Division, the secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's office, documented increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Newland, a member of the monitoring team, reported in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have become quiet. They still maintain loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America." The camp newspapers, produced by prisoners themselves, began reflecting this transformation. Der Ruff, the call published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners, found their audience increasingly receptive to ideas that would have been rejected as enemy propaganda just months earlier. Lieutenant Hermann Gigi, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors, We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military prowess. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals, but perhaps the most devastating blow to Nazi ideology came from an unexpected source: the treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Italian prisoners who agreed to cooperate were formed into Italian service units, given better quarters, increased pay, and more freedom. German prisoners watched their former allies working alongside Americans, eating in American restaurants, some even dating American women. Hauptmann Friedrich Schultz wrote with obvious anguish, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred for changing sides. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system." Christmas 1943 provided the most profound psychological impact yet. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners of war enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers just months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Hearn sent in homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory and propaganda about American brutality. Oberleutnant Walter Muller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote with evident confusion and growing comprehension, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies, yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power." The Christmas feast itself defied every assumption about American society that Nazi propaganda had created. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream, quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they were physically sick, unable to comprehend such resources being lavished on enemies. "We ate like kings," wrote Feldwebel Hans Weiss, "better than German generals eat, better than party leaders, and this was not special. The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat?" As winter turned to spring in 1944, the psychological transformation of the German prisoners was becoming systematic and comprehensive. Over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs, studying English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable among men who had been told Americans were culturally barbarous. Prisoners discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, scientific research that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints, something impossible in Nazi Germany. This intellectual freedom, combined with daily evidence of American prosperity, was completing the ideological transformation that physical abundance had begun. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge with enemies. This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology." As Part 2 concludes, we've seen how German prisoners witnessed American abundance that systematically demolished Nazi propaganda about American weakness. But their greatest shocks were yet to come. In Part 3, We'll explore how these prisoners experienced the full fury of American war production at its peak, and how the D-Day invasion would finally convince them that Germany's defeat was not just probable, but mathematically inevitable. Spring 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production reached its absolute peak, and with these programs came the most devastating demonstrations yet of American industrial supremacy. German prisoners of war worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing the full fury of the arsenal of democracy operating at maximum capacity. The numbers alone told a story that no propaganda could counter. But it was the casual efficiency with which these numbers were achieved that completed the psychological demolition of Nazi ideology. At the Higgins boat factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for the invasion of Europe. They watched as workers assembled 700 boats per month, each one requiring 20,000 precision-manufactured parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed production lines with a competence that challenged every Nazi assumption about gender roles and industrial organization. Stabsfeldwebel, Kurt Zimmermann wrote with evident amazement, women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment, everything, we were told, was impossible in a democracy, yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in a month than our entire Navy built in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. The blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale defied German comprehension. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr Valley at its peacetime peak. I worked at Krupp before the war, wrote Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann. I thought I understood industrial production, but this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce. The workers complained about overtime while producing quantities we could not achieve with slave labor and double shifts. But it was the 1944 harvest that provided the final demolition of Nazi propaganda about American weakness and resource limitations. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, witnessing agricultural production that could literally feed the world. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvests where single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships across an ocean of gold, each one harvesting 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. The casual abundance was staggering to men from a nation where every grain had been counted and rationed since 1939. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 German farmers. They showed me aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined in California's Central Valley. Prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured in wartime Germany. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain prices, a concept that caused psychological breakdown among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. They destroyed food to keep prices stable," wrote Jeff writer Otto Schultz with obvious anguish. "Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to be allowed to send them to Germany, to our families. The guards were sympathetic but explained it was impossible. The waste was strategic proof of unlimited resources." Then came June 6, 1944, when news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps. German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of Operation Overlord: 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave demonstrated American organizational capacity that was beyond Nazi Germany's wildest nightmares. This wasn't just military superiority. It was the systematic application of American industrial might to the problem of crossing the English Channel and establishing a second front. Prisoners at Camp Shelby watched newsreels of the invasion within days of the landings. They saw the endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors that had been constructed in Britain and towed across the Channel, the supply system that was delivering 15,000 tons of material daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight. Oberst Friedrich von Seckendorff-Faberdar wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources." Throughout their captivity, German prisoners had experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than any material demonstration of wealth: American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and sentimental, prisoners discovered a people secure enough in their strength to show mercy to enemies. When Jeff Reiter, Hans Muller's son, died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fischer's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her address in Germany. Enemy civilians, in a nation America was actively bombing, they separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Hauptmann Otto Schmidt. They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. This distinction, which seemed like propaganda, proved genuine. They prepared us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. The medical treatment particularly affected prisoners accustomed to the brutal efficiency of military medicine. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques, using advanced equipment. Prisoners received operations that would have been available only to the elite in Germany. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was provided to traumatized soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Babor wrote, "They treated attempted suicides with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners with mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings." This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we never understood, the confidence of true power. By March 1945, the secret re-education program had produced remarkable results that exceeded all expectations. Over 25,000 prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in democracy courses. The camp newspapers published articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war, with former Wehrmacht officers planning how to implement American agricultural methods and democratic institutions in post-war Germany. The program's success was so complete that American authorities began to worry about prisoners being too enthusiastic about American ways. Some requested to stay in America after the war. Others married American women they had met through prison correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to America in the 1950s, carrying with them detailed knowledge of how American democracy and capitalism actually functioned. "We became missionaries for democracy," admitted Oberst Hermann Gringnow, relation to the Reichsmarschall in a 1975 interview. "Not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than German aristocracy. We wanted that for Germany." The transformation was so complete that American intelligence officers documented cases of former Nazi officers requesting permission to write letters to Hitler, urging surrender to prevent further destruction of Germany. These letters, of course, were never sent, but their existence demonstrated the psychological revolution that had taken place in the minds of men who had once been willing to die for the Third Reich. April 1945 brought the final and most devastating revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps throughout Germany, the footage was shown to German prisoners of war. Many refused to believe it initially, claiming it was propaganda designed to justify Allied brutality. But the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from American soldiers, photographs from multiple sources, newsreels from different camera crews, and eventually letters from Germany confirming the horror. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Men who had maintained some pride in German honor despite military defeat now faced the complete moral collapse of everything they had fought for. The nation they had served, the cause they had believed in, the system they had defended, was not merely defeated, was revealed as fundamentally evil. Hauptmann Walter Schmidt wrote what may have been the most eloquent summary of this final transformation. We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant. As the war ended in May 1945, German prisoners of war faced repatriation with emotions that would have been incomprehensible to them 2 years earlier. They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. They had been treated with more dignity by enemies than by their own government. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers, lived in better conditions as captives than many had known as civilians. The final months of captivity were spent preparing for return to a Germany that existed now only in ruins. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. Prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was publicly announced, understanding that America intended to rebuild rather than punish Germany. They prepared us to rebuild our country, wrote Oberst Friedrich von Seckendorff-Barda. They gave us skills, knowledge, hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens. This generosity from victors was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners of war were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute. But they brought with them something precious, detailed, first-hand knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. They had seen prosperity achieved through freedom rather than conquest, strength derived from diversity rather than racial purity, efficiency created through voluntary cooperation rather than totalitarian coercion. The statistics of their captivity tell a remarkable story. Of the 371,683 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with only 2,222 total escape attempts recorded. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war, relationships that had begun in prison camps but evolved into genuine friendships. But the true measure of the program's success would be seen in the decades that followed. Many former prisoners of war rose to prominence in West Germany's reconstruction. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Halston, who taught classes at Camp Como, became president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Weckmer, held at Camp Herne, served as German permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackerman, prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps, where former enemies had learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. In Part 4, we'll explore the long-term impact of this extraordinary transformation, examining how former prisoners became architects of Germany's democratic reconstruction and how their experience shaped the Atlantic alliance that would define the post-war world. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s had roots that reached back to prison camps scattered across the American heartland, where former Wehrmacht officers had learned lessons that would reshape European civilization. The Wirtschaftswunder, as historians would later term it, was built on foundations laid not in German universities or government ministries, but in the barracks and work details where enemy soldiers had witnessed American industrial democracy in operation. Hans Kroll's journey from prisoner at Camp Shelby to West German ambassador to the United States exemplified this transformation. As a young panzer officer captured in Tunisia, He had arrived in Mississippi, convinced of German military superiority and American weakness. 2 years of witnessing American industrial capacity and democratic institutions had converted him into what he would later describe as a missionary for German-American friendship. In his 1967 memoirs, Kroll wrote, "My real education began not at university, but in an American prison camp. I learned that democracy was not weakness, but strength, that diversity was not division, but creativity, that prosperity came not from conquest, but from cooperation. These lessons, learned as a prisoner of war, shaped every decision I made as a diplomat." Walter Hallstein's experience was equally transformative. Captured as a Luftwaffe officer and held at Camp Como, he had organized education classes for fellow prisoners, teaching law and constitutional theory. But his American captors had insisted that German prisoners also attend lectures by American professors on democratic government and free market economics. Initially resistant, Hallstein gradually became fascinated by the systematic differences between American and German approaches to political organization. "The Americans didn't try to convert us through propaganda," Hallstein later recalled. "They simply demonstrated that their system worked better than ours. Production was higher, living standards were better, social mobility was greater, and individual freedom was broader. The evidence was overwhelming." After repatriation, Hallstein became one of the primary architects of European integration, serving as the first president of the European Commission. His vision of a unified Europe was deeply influenced by his observations of American federalism during his captivity. The European Economic Community that emerged in the 1950s bore striking resemblances to American interstate commerce arrangements that former prisoners of war had studied in detail during their captivity. The agricultural transformation of post-war Germany provides perhaps the clearest example of how prison camp experiences translated into national reconstruction. Edward Ackerman, who had worked on American farms while held at Fort Robinson, returned to Germany with detailed knowledge of mechanized agriculture, hybrid seeds, and chemical fertilizers that were decades ahead of German farming methods. Working with the American occupation authorities, and later with the West German government, Ackerman helped establish agricultural extension services modeled directly on the American system he had observed as a prisoner. German farms that had struggled to feed the population during the war were transformed into efficient producers that created food surpluses by the 1960s. "Everything I knew about modern farming I learned while picking corn in Nebraska," Ackerman wrote in 1975. American farmers taught a German prisoner techniques that German agricultural colleges would adopt for another decade. The irony was, complete the enemies had better knowledge than our own experts. The industrial transformation was equally dramatic. Former prisoners who had witnessed American factory automation, quality control systems, and labor relations brought these concepts back to German manufacturing. The Volkswagen Beetle, that became a symbol of German recovery in the 1950s, was produced using assembly line techniques that former prisoners had observed in American automotive plants during their captivity. Heinrich Nordhoff, who would later lead Volkswagen's transformation into a global automotive power, had been influenced by former prisoners who served as technical advisors in the company's reconstruction. The efficiency and quality control methods that made Volkswagen competitive were direct adaptations of American manufacturing processes that prisoners had witnessed firsthand. But perhaps the most profound impact was on German political culture itself. The stable democracy that emerged in West Germany was built by men who had experienced American democratic institutions as prisoners of war. They had participated in camp councils, observed American judicial procedures, and witnessed the peaceful transfer of power in American elections during their captivity. Rudiger von Weckmer, who had been held at Camp Herne, later served as permanent representative to the United Nations and as president of the UN General Assembly. His approach to international diplomacy was profoundly shaped by his observations of American foreign policy decision-making during his captivity. "I learned that American power came not from military force, though they had that in abundance, but from moral authority. von Weckmer reflected in a 1980 interview. They treated enemies with dignity, they shared knowledge freely, they rebuilt rather than destroyed. These were lessons in statecraft that no German university could have taught. The success of these former prisoners in post-war German leadership was not coincidental. They possessed something that traditional German elites lacked: detailed, practical knowledge of how American institutions actually functioned. While other Germans were learning about democracy from books and lectures, these men had lived within American society for years, observing its strengths and weaknesses from the inside. This practical knowledge became invaluable during the Marshall Plan period, when Germany needed to rapidly adapt American economic and political models. Former prisoners served as interpreters, advisors, and implementers of American aid programs. Their understanding of American business practices, agricultural techniques, and administrative procedures accelerated Germany's recovery beyond what would have been possible otherwise. The psychological transformation that had begun in prison camps continued to influence German-American relations for decades. The Atlantic Alliance that emerged in the 1950s was built on foundations of trust and understanding that traced back to prison camp experiences. German leaders who had witnessed American strength and magnanimity as captives became advocates for close cooperation with the United States. This influence extended beyond individual careers to shape entire institutions. The German military that was reconstituted in the 1950s as the Bundeswehr was organized along principles that former prisoners had observed in the American Army during their captivity. The emphasis on individual responsibility, technical competence, and civilian control reflected lessons learned in American prison camps rather than traditional Prussian military doctrine. German universities were similarly influenced. The expansion of higher education in the 1960s followed American models that former prisoners had studied during their captivity. The emphasis on research, practical application, and broad access reflected American educational philosophy rather than the elitist traditions of German universities. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German prisoners of war held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families to show them where their transformation had begun. The reunion became a celebration of one of history's most successful examples of peaceful conversion of former enemies into allies. Former Obergefreiter Hans Weber, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to become a physician in Georgetown, West Germany, spoke at the reunion dinner. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, we discovered dignity. Former Stabsfeld-Wibble, Kurt Meyer, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us, this changed us forever." The reunion's keynote address was delivered by former Oberst Hermann Gigi, then 78 years old. His words captured the essence of the transformation that had begun 42 years earlier on a train platform in Texas. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom." As Part 4 concludes, we've seen how the transformation begun in American prison camps shaped the reconstruction of Germany and the reemergence of the Atlantic Alliance. In Part 5, we examine the broader lessons of this extraordinary episode and its relevance to understanding how democratic societies can prevail over totalitarian ideologies, not through force alone, but through the power of example. The reunion in Austin represented more than nostalgia. It demonstrated the enduring power of transformation that had begun in prison camps across America 4 decades earlier. The assembled former prisoners, now successful citizens of democratic Germany, Their children who had grown up in freedom, and their American hosts who had once been their captors, embodied a truth about human nature that authoritarian ideologies consistently underestimate. Given the opportunity to witness genuine prosperity and freedom, most people will choose these over ideology and coercion. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the preeminent historian of German prisoners in America, attended the reunion and observed something remarkable. Here were men who had arrived as fanatical believers in Nazi ideology, he noted, transformed not through brainwashing or coercion, but through simple exposure to American society at its peak effectiveness. They became some of the most effective advocates for democracy in post-war Europe because their conversion was genuine, based on observed evidence rather than propaganda. This transformation had implications that extended far beyond individual lives or even German reconstruction. The prison camp experience provided a template for how democratic societies could engage with ideological enemies, offering an alternative to the cycle of revenge and recrimination that had characterized European conflicts for centuries. The success of the American approach lay in its confidence. Rather than trying to hide American society from enemy prisoners, camp administrators allowed Devon encouraged prisoners to see American industrial capacity, agricultural abundance, and social mobility in operation. This transparency reflected a fundamental confidence in the superiority of democratic institutions, a confidence that proved fully justified by results. The psychological mechanisms at work were subtle but powerful. Nazi ideology depended on claims about American weakness, racial inferiority, and economic instability. Each day of captivity in America provided evidence that contradicted these claims. The cognitive dissonance created by this contradiction eventually forced prisoners to choose between ideology and observed reality. The overwhelming majority chose reality. This process was aided by the absence of coercion in the American approach. Prisoners were not forced to attend re-education classes or renounce their beliefs. Instead, they were simply exposed to American society and allowed to draw their own conclusions. This respect for individual judgment, even among enemies, reflected democratic principles in action and proved more effective than any propaganda program could have been. The medical treatment provided to prisoners offers a particularly striking example of how American humanity served strategic purposes. When German prisoners received better medical care than they had known as soldiers in their own army, the message was clear. American society valued human life, even enemy life, more than the Nazi system valued its own soldiers. This demonstration of superior values proved more persuasive than any lecture on democracy could have been. The work programs served a similar function. By employing prisoners in American agriculture and light industry, the camps inadvertently provided comprehensive education in American economic methods. Prisoners witnessed mechanized farming, industrial automation, and labor relations that were decades ahead of German practices. They returned to Germany with practical knowledge that accelerated reconstruction and modernization. The scale of American production that prisoners witnessed was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of their captivity. Nazi propaganda had prepared them to expect American weakness and industrial inadequacy. Instead, they found production capacity that dwarfed German capabilities, even at peacetime levels. The casual waste they observed, perfectly good food discarded, lights left burning in empty buildings, new equipment replacing functional older models, spoke to abundance beyond German imagination. This abundance was not merely material, but intellectual and cultural as well. Prisoners discovered American libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed students from all social classes, and newspapers that freely criticized government policies. This intellectual freedom contrasted sharply with the rigid control of information in Nazi Germany and provided prisoners with their first experience of genuine debate and discussion. The camp newspapers produced by prisoners themselves became laboratories of democratic discourse. Initially dominated by Nazi ideology, these publications gradually evolved to include diverse viewpoints, open debate, and criticism of both American and German policies. This evolution reflected the prisoners' growing comfort with democratic principles and their increasing confidence in expressing dissenting opinions. The treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender provided a particularly powerful lesson in American strategic thinking. Rather than punishing the Italians for changing sides, Americans rewarded cooperation with better treatment and increased privileges. This pragmatic approach to former enemies demonstrated that American policy was based on results rather than ideology, a lesson that German prisoners absorbed and would later apply in their own careers. The Christmas celebrations, organized by American communities for German prisoners, represented the culmination of this humanitarian approach. The sight of American families sending gifts to enemy soldiers, of church choirs performing German carols for men who had been trying to kill their sons and brothers, provided the most powerful possible demonstration of Christian charity and democratic values in action. These gestures were not calculated propaganda but genuine expressions of American values, which made them even more effective. Prisoners could recognize the difference between staged demonstrations and authentic behavior, and they responded accordingly. The humanity shown to enemies revealed a society confident enough in its own strength to extend mercy to the defeated. The educational programs established in the camps went beyond mere literacy or vocational training to include comprehensive instruction in democratic theory and practice. University professors volunteered to teach courses on American history, constitutional law, and economic theory. These classes were attended by increasing numbers of prisoners as word spread about the quality of instruction and the absence of political coercion. The success of these programs exceeded all expectations. By war's end, thousands of prisoners had earned university credits, learned new trades, and acquired fluency in English. More importantly, they had gained practical understanding of how democratic institutions functioned in daily life. This knowledge proved invaluable during Germany's post-war reconstruction. The low escape rate among German prisoners reflected not just effective security but genuine contentment with their treatment. Many prisoners lived better in American camps than they had as civilians in Depression-era Germany. The combination of adequate food, medical care, educational opportunities, and humane treatment created conditions that few prisoners wanted to leave, even had escape been possible. The correspondence relationships that developed between prisoners and American families provided lasting bonds that outlived the war by decades. These personal connections became channels for continued cultural and economic exchange, contributing to the close German-American relationship that emerged in the 1950s. Former prisoners served as bridges between societies, facilitating understanding and cooperation. The reunion in Austin in 1985 provided an opportunity to measure the long-term impact of the prison camp experience. The success of former prisoners in post-war German society was remarkable. They had become doctors, professors, business leaders, and diplomats at rates far exceeding the general population. Their exposure to American society had given them competitive advantages in the rapidly modernizing post-war world. Part 6 will examine the broader historical significance of this extraordinary transformation and its lessons for contemporary conflicts between democratic and authoritarian societies. The story of German prisoners of war in America represents one of the most successful examples of peaceful, ideological transformation in modern history, offering profound lessons about the nature of soft power and the ultimate superiority of democratic values over authoritarian alternatives. The magnitude of this success becomes clear when measured against the comprehensive failure of similar efforts in other contexts, and the remarkable durability of the transformation achieved. Statistical analysis reveals the extent of this success. Of the 371,683 German prisoners held in America, post-war surveys indicated that over 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. More remarkably, 74% reported that their captivity had positively changed their worldview. while 61% expressed interest in learning more about democratic institutions. Less than 10% maintained strong Nazi beliefs by war's end, a transformation rate that exceeded the most optimistic projections of American planners. The escape statistics tell an equally remarkable story. With only 2,222 escape attempts from over 371,000 prisoners, a rate of 0.6% and 0 successful permanent escapes, German prisoners demonstrated unprecedented contentment with their captivity. This stood in stark contrast to prisoner populations in other conflicts, where escape rates typically ranged from 10 to 20%. The long-term impact extended far beyond individual transformation. The former prisoners who returned to Germany brought with them detailed knowledge of American industrial methods, agricultural techniques, and political institutions that proved invaluable during Reconstruction. They became a bridge between American and German societies, facilitating the rapid development of the Atlantic Alliance that would define post-war European security. The economic data is equally compelling. The Marshall Plan's success in Germany was accelerated by the presence of thousands of former prisoners who understood American business practices, administrative procedures, and technological innovations. German industrial productivity recovered to pre-war levels by 1948, a full 2 years ahead of projections, largely due to the rapid adoption of American methods by managers and technicians who had observed these techniques during captivity. The political transformation was even more significant. The stable democracy that emerged in West Germany was shaped by leaders who had experienced American democratic institutions firsthand. The Bundestag, the German Constitutional Court, and the federal system of government all reflected lessons learned in American prison camps rather than traditional German political models. This success story offers several crucial lessons for contemporary conflicts between democratic and authoritarian ideologies. First, it demonstrates that ideological conviction, no matter how deeply held, cannot withstand prolonged exposure to contradictory evidence. The Nazi prisoners arrived with beliefs reinforced by years of propaganda and military indoctrination. Yet these convictions crumbled when confronted with daily evidence of American prosperity and freedom. Second, the American approach succeeded because it relied on demonstration rather than argumentation. Rather than trying to convince prisoners through lectures or propaganda, American authorities simply allowed them to observe American society in operation. This transparency reflected confidence in democratic institutions and proved far more persuasive than any attempt at ideological conversion. Third, the treatment of prisoners as human beings rather than ideological enemies proved crucial to their transformation. The medical care, educational opportunities, and simple dignity accorded to captives demonstrated democratic values in action more effectively than any theoretical discussion could have accomplished. Fourth, the work programs provided practical education in American economic methods while meeting legitimate labor needs. This dual purpose made the programs sustainable and effective while giving prisoners useful skills and comprehensive understanding of American industrial capacity. The psychological mechanisms underlying this transformation offer insights into human nature and political behavior that remain relevant today. The cognitive dissonance created by exposure to evidence contradicting fundamental beliefs eventually forced prisoners to choose between ideology and observed reality. The vast majority chose reality, suggesting that most people, given accurate information, will make rational choices about political systems. The importance of credibility in this process cannot be overstated. American claims about democratic superiority were credible because they were supported by visible evidence of prosperity, freedom, and technological advancement. The prisoners could see that American workers lived better than German aristocrats, that American farms produced more food than could be consumed, and that American factories manufactured goods at scales that defied German imagination. The role of individual agency in the transformation process was equally crucial. Prisoners were not forced to abandon their beliefs, but were given the freedom to evaluate evidence and reach their own conclusions. This respect for individual judgment, even among enemies, demonstrated democratic principles, while making the resulting conversions more genuine and durable. The success of the American approach contrasts sharply with the failure of coercive re-education programs in other contexts. The absence of force or psychological pressure in American camps allowed prisoners to maintain their dignity while changing their beliefs, resulting in transformations that lasted decades rather than collapsing when external pressure was removed. The timing of the prison camp experience proved fortuitous, occurring at the peak of American industrial production and social confidence. Prisoners witnessed American society at its most effective moment, when wartime mobilization had achieved unprecedented levels of production and national unity. This timing maximized the psychological impact of their observations. The diversity of American society that prisoners encountered also played a crucial role in their transformation. They worked alongside women in factories, observed African Americans operating complex machinery, and witnessed immigrants contributing to the war effort. This diversity contradicted Nazi racial theories while demonstrating the strength that comes from inclusion rather than exclusion. The generosity shown to prisoners, particularly during Christmas 1943, provided powerful evidence of American values in action. The sight of American families sending gifts to enemy soldiers demonstrated a level of Christian charity and democratic compassion that was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology. This generosity revealed a society so confident in its own strength that it could afford to show mercy to defeated enemies. The educational programs established in the camps provided prisoners with tools for critical thinking that served them well in post-war careers. The emphasis on open discussion, multiple perspectives, and evidence-based reasoning contrasted sharply with the rigid indoctrination they had received in Nazi Germany. These intellectual skills proved as valuable as the technical knowledge they acquired. The personal relationships that developed between prisoners and American guards, farmers, and community members created lasting bonds that outlived the war. These connections became channels for continued cultural exchange and mutual understanding, contributing to the close alliance that emerged between America and Germany in the post-war period. The reunion in Austin in 1985 provided a final demonstration of the transformation's durability. After 40 years, former prisoners still credited their American captivity with changing their lives and shaping their careers. Their children, raised in democratic Germany, represented the generational transmission of values learned in American prison camps. The words of former Oberst Hermann Gigi at that reunion captured the essence of what had been accomplished. We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. The applause that followed these words, Americans and Germans together, former enemies, united in recognition of transformation, represented the ultimate victory of democratic values over totalitarian ideology. It was a victory achieved not through force of arms, but through the simple, overwhelming power of example. The German prisoners who experienced American abundance between 1943 and 1946 returned to their homeland carrying more than memories. They carried practical knowledge, democratic values, and unshakable confidence in the superiority of free societies. They became architects of Germany's reconstruction, builders of the Atlantic Alliance, and living proof that even the most indoctrinated enemies can be transformed into friends through the patient application of democratic principles. Their story stands as testament to a profound truth about human nature and political systems. Given the choice between oppression and freedom, between scarcity and abundance, between hatred and tolerance, most people will choose wisely. The challenge for democratic societies is to provide that choice, to demonstrate their values in action, and to have confidence that truth will ultimately prevail over propaganda. The transformation of German prisoners in American camps proves that the most powerful weapon in democracy's arsenal is not military might, though that may be necessary, but the simple, undeniable evidence of what free people can achieve when they work together. In that evidence lies the hope for peaceful resolution of ideological conflicts and the ultimate triumph of human dignity over authoritarian control.